My name is David Warner Matheson, and for the past 8 years I've been exploring the connection between the myths and the stars. Based on overwhelming evidence, I'm convinced that the world's ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories are based upon a common system of celestial metaphor. That is, the world's ancient myths from virtually every inhabited continent and island use a common system or language that encodes the heavenly motions of the sun, the moon, the earth, the visible planets, and, most of all, the stars and constellations. In the form of gods, goddesses, kings, queens, brave heroes, beautiful maidens, monsters, giants, and their adventures and exploits. After much consideration, I've come to the conclusion that these ancient myths were never intended to be understood as literal, terrestrial history, but that instead they actually use the majestic, infinite, and awe-inspiring heavens as a metaphor, a visible way of showing us an invisible realm which is very real, but which is difficult for us to comprehend without the use of metaphor and symbol. It's as if I had a collection of furniture, and this furniture, in this analogy, is invisible. It's real, and it's really there, but we can't see it. If I took a blanket and I cast this blanket over the furniture, then I can make out the shape that's underneath, even though in this analogy the furniture is invisible. The furniture is invisible, but the blanket enables us to see it. In this analogy, the blanket is like the collection of myths and sacred stories from one culture. And the blanket itself is different from one culture to another, from one continent to another, from one climate to another. Sometimes the blanket is very thick and plush and elaborately embroidered. Sometimes it's very thin and gauzy and almost transparent. But in every case, it's actually illuminating the same body of invisible truths. In fact, you're not even really supposed to concentrate too much on the blanket itself. It's just there to help us to perceive the invisible forms that are underneath and that otherwise we would not be able to see.
Let's illustrate this concept by examining just one example from the New Testament of the Bible, and then see the evidence that this episode is based on the motion of the stars, and then see how this episode relates to similar myths from other cultures which can be shown to be based on the exact same stars. The accounts describing the encounter of Jesus and John the Baptist are found in more than one of the canonical Gospels and contain many specific details that point us towards the understanding that this scene is describing events in the heavens. If we look to the stars to discover the identity of John the Baptist, one constellation stands out as an obvious possibility: the zodiac constellation of Aquarius, the water bearer, whose outlines suggest a human figure holding a water vessel and pouring out 2 streams of water. These streams of water are actually positioned to pour out upon the constellation of the southern fish, Pisces austrinus, outlined here in green. Interestingly enough, if we look at sacred artwork down through the ages, John the Baptist is often depicted in a body position or posture, which is very suggestive of the outline of the constellation Aquarius in the sky. In fact, Jesus is almost invariably depicted with his hands together, in a hand gesture known in ancient India as the mudra, representing namaskaram, a gesture signaling the recognition of divinity in oneself and in another. And this gesture can, with some imagination, be thought of as being related to the outline of the body of a fish. Even more revealing than the artwork down through the centuries are the clues within the ancient texts themselves, which provide strong evidence to conclude that this episode is celestial in nature, depicting the constellations as characters in a drama in order to convey truths to our understanding that we might otherwise be unable to grasp. If John the Baptist is a character based upon the constellation Aquarius, then this helps to explain the passage in the Gospels which tells us that John saw Jesus coming towards him and identified him as the Lamb of God. The constellation Aries, the ram, is indeed positioned in the sky as though coming towards the constellation Aquarius. Here's the location of Aries, the ram. Can you see why the positioning of this constellation in relation to the constellation which plays the role of John the Baptist causes John to say what he says? This is a textual clue that helps us to identify the scene as celestial in nature, and that points us towards the correct identification of the different players in the scene. The next important constellation referenced in the accounts of this episode is the mighty form of Orion, a massive figure in the night sky and one with a number of very bright stars, including his famous belt of 3 stars, making him very distinctive and recognizable in the heavens when he's present in the sky. In order to recognize the textual clue in the Bible, we must understand that the constellations cross the sky from east to west, just as the sun does, due to the rotation of our planet towards the east. Thus, Orion and all the other constellations will follow a circular path caused by the rotation of our globe on its axis, and depending on their location in the heavens, we won't be able to see them for much of that circle, because much of that circle will disappear behind the horizon as we're standing on the planet. So just like the sun's path does. So therefore, we'll see an arc length of that circle instead. It will rise up from the east and arc across the sky, and then it'll arc back down into the west. And this helps us to understand John's next comment, in which he declares that there is one coming after him who is mightier than John. The text is talking here about the figure of Orion, which is indeed a mighty constellation. One of the strongest clues that John is indeed here referring to Orion is the declaration that this mightier one has a fan in his hand. He has his fan in his hand with which he is going to purge his floor and gather the grain into his garner, by which we know that the text is referring to a winnowing fan used for separating wheat from chaff in pre-industrial societies. Can you see the feature in the outline of the constellation Orion that identifies him as the one who is carrying this winnowing fan? This should pretty much clinch the identification, but just in case we're still not sure, John later says this line, "He must increase, but I must decrease," which I would argue is celestial in nature, describing the relative motions of the 2 celestial figures, with John the Baptist, identified with Aquarius, sinking down in the west, even as Orion is rising up from the east. Aquarius is decreasing in elevation, even as Orion is increasing. What's very significant about this reference to a winnowing fan is that we find a nearly identical reference in the myths of ancient Greece, in the adventures of Odysseus, described in the Odyssey, thought by some scholars to have originated by around 800 BC and perhaps even earlier. Specifically, the winnowing fan is described during the voyage of Odysseus to the land of the dead, where he must consult with the shade of the great seer Tiresias. Here is one ancient artist's depiction of the scene. On a piece of pottery, displaying the red figure technique, and the figure at the center is Odysseus, holding a knife because he's sacrificing a ram to attract the shades of the dead. Does a ram sound familiar? The head of the departed Tiresias can be seen rising up near the bottom of the scene, right here. When Tiresias tells Odysseus what he must do, a winnowing fan features prominently in the instructions of the old seer. he tells Odysseus, "But once you have killed those suitors in your halls, go forth once more you must. Carry your well-planed oar until you come to a race of people who know nothing of the sea, and here is your sign, unmistakable, clear, so clear you cannot miss it. When another traveler falls in with you and calls that weight across your shoulder a fan to winnow grain, then plant your bladed balanced oar in the earth and sacrifice fine beasts to the Lord of the sea, Poseidon." Clearly, what we have here is a completely different story, but one that is based on the exact same constellations that we've just been dealing with. In both cases, there's a clear identification with the figure of Orion and a reference to the distinctive feature of Orion's outline, which is interpreted in these myths as a fan to winnow grain, that is, to separate the wheat from the chaff. And interestingly enough, the theme of separation is one that is very much associated with the figure of Orion and with star myths around the world in which Orion plays a prominent role. It's actually very well established and widely accepted even among conventional academia that the god Osiris of ancient Egypt was explicitly identified in ancient times with the heavenly figure of Orion. And Osiris is a god who experiences separation. He's a god who was murdered by his brother Set, and whose body was placed into a casket and cast into the sea, after which it was lost for a time, and the goddess Isis searched all over the world for it. Osiris then became the god of the underworld, the god who was slain, but who would later be restored. Note that this very same pattern can be seen in the life of Odysseus, who was also lost at sea, separated from his wife and his home, but later restored. And of course, we see the same pattern in the gospel stories of the Christ, who was slain and placed into the ground for a time before rising again. The fact that Osiris is associated with Orion can be seen in these depictions of ancient Egyptian temple reliefs in which the figure of Osiris is horizontal on a lion couch, but still retains a striding posture. Who lies down on a couch in a posture like they're walking, like this? It makes very little sense unless we understand that Osiris is associated with the constellation Orion, whose outline has the very same striding posture. And from this understanding of the theme of separation, of going down into the earth for a time, being lost at sea for a time, before being restored, we can begin to perceive what these particular myths might be telling us. They're actually describing the human condition, cast down into the material realm, this physical realm, this incarnate realm, cast down out of the invisible realm, the infinite realm, but still very much connected to that invisible realm. Although we're separated for a time, we're still possessed of a divine spark, like a god who's been slain or cast down to the underworld. We're in the underworld right now. The stories are about us, the invisible realm, the physical realm, and our separation from it, our temporary separation from it. And the stars themselves can metaphorically be seen to illustrate the very same message. They cycle through the heavens only to sink down into the western horizon, disappearing into the lower elements of earth and water. However, even though they are, metaphorically speaking, imprisoned in the earth for a time, or cast down into the sea for a time, we can observe that they do in fact rise up again into the celestial realms when they pop back up from the eastern horizon to soar again into the heavens. I hope that this brief set of examples will help to illustrate the way in which the ancient myths use the visible motions of the heavenly cycles to make visible to us truths about invisible subjects. There are literally thousands of other examples which show that virtually all the world's ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories are based on a common system of celestial metaphor, designed for our benefit, an ancient treasure imparted to humanity like a precious inheritance.